If you have anxious attachment, one of the most painful things in the world is needing clarity and feeling like the price of asking for it might be punishment. That is the whole emotional trap. You are not just afraid of the answer. You are afraid of what asking will do to the bond. You are afraid that one honest question will change the temperature, ruin the mood, make them pull away, make them colder, make them slower, make them act overwhelmed, make them say you are too much, make them treat your need like pressure. And once that fear gets wired into the relationship, something very damaging starts happening. You stop only managing your feelings. You start managing your questions. You start editing what you want to know. You start swallowing what hurts. You start softening what is real. You start trying to get reassurance without sounding like you need reassurance. You start trying to get clarity without asking for clarity. You start trying to protect the relationship from the emotional impact of your own honesty. That is the structure versus story problem. The story says, maybe this is okay. Maybe I just need to be calmer. Maybe the timing is off. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should trust. Maybe I should not ruin a good moment. But the structure says something much harder. If asking a normal relationship question keeps feeling dangerous, then the issue is not only your anxiety. The issue is that the bond is teaching your nervous system that honesty costs connection. And once a bond starts teaching you that, you do not just become anxious. You become self-silencing. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. One of the hardest truths here is that anxious people often know exactly what they want to ask. The problem is not confusion. The problem is consequence. They want to ask, what are we doing? They want to ask, why do you get close and then disappear? They want to ask, do you actually want this? Or do you just want access to me when it feels good? They want to ask, why do I feel like I keep paying for your discomfort? They want to ask, why does it feel like I am only allowed to be easy? They want to ask, why does warmth suddenly become distance the minute I believe you? They want to ask, why does my honesty seem to create more punishment than your inconsistency does? They want to ask, am I safe with you? Or am I just trying to survive you without losing you? Those are not dramatic questions. Those are relationship questions. Those are body questions. Those are questions that naturally rise when structure and story start separating. The story says there is chemistry, softness, history, tenderness, potential, longing, maybe even love. The structure says you are becoming afraid of your own mouth. And if you have anxious attachment, that split can destroy your inner peace, because you start living in two truths at once. One truth says, this connection matters. The other says, I do not feel safe enough to ask what it actually is. One truth says, they care. The other says, I keep paying for bringing reality into the room. One truth says, maybe it can work. The other says, why does honesty feel like a threat here? That is why this topic matters so much, because a lot of anxious people are not only suffering from uncertainty, they are suffering from the cost of trying to interrupt uncertainty. Let us name the structure clearly. In a healthy structure, hard questions may still feel vulnerable, but they do not feel forbidden. You might be nervous to ask, but you do not feel like basic honesty will make the whole bond collapse. You do not feel like one real conversation will make you lose your place. You do not feel like asking for clarity will automatically turn you into the problem. In an unhealthy structure, the opposite starts happening. You learn that closeness is allowed, but only if you do not define it. You learn that warmth is allowed, but only if you do not ask what it means. You learn that they can take emotional access to you, but you cannot always ask what responsibility comes with that access. You learn that your intuition is right often enough to hurt, but not safe enough to speak. That is when the structure starts training you. And what it trains is not just anxiety. It trains self-betrayal. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask without punishment is, why do I have to act less affected than I am just to keep this from tipping? That is one of the loneliest feelings in these dynamics. You know you care. You know you are affected. You know the distance changes you. You know the inconsistency lands in your body. But you also know, or think you know, that if you reveal the full impact, the other person may call it pressure, neediness, drama, overthinking, intensity, or bad timing. So now you are not simply trying to relate, you are trying to perform emotional moderation in order to stay acceptable. That is exhausting. It creates a very specific kind of pain because your body knows the truth before your behavior does. Your body knows you are not calm. Your body knows you are monitoring the bond. Your body knows the silence changed your state. Your body knows the last mixed signal reopened the whole thing. But your behavior starts saying, I'm fine, no worries, take your time, all good, don't stress, no pressure. That is not always emotional maturity. Sometimes it is nervous system diplomacy. Sometimes it is fear disguised as chill. The story will tell you that being understanding keeps the connection safe. The structure will tell you something harsher. Why is your honesty the thing that keeps threatening the bond more than their instability? Another thing anxious people wish they could ask is, what exactly am I supposed to do with all the implied closeness if I am not allowed to name it? This is a huge one in anxious dynamics because a lot of the pain comes from implication without structure. There is the way they look at you, the way they return, the way they soften, the way they remember details, the way they get emotionally close, the way they create almost relationship energy. And then there is the strange emptiness that appears when you try to bring the reality of that closeness into language. Suddenly, it gets blurry. Suddenly, they need space. Suddenly, they are confused. Suddenly, labels feel heavy. Suddenly, timing is wrong. Suddenly, you are moving too fast for asking the question that their own behavior made natural. If you have anxious attachment, that can make you feel almost crazy because the emotional atmosphere is one thing and the explicit structure is another. The story says, but look how real it feels. The structure says, why does it feel unsafe to ask what real means here? That is the question that reveals everything. Another thing they wish they could ask without punishment is, why does your discomfort become more important than my confusion? This one cuts deep because it gets to the power imbalance inside many anxious, avoidant dynamics. The anxious person is often expected to manage more emotional discomfort in silence. They carry ambiguity, delayed replies, inconsistent energy, half-open doors, emotional reversals, vague language, and the constant work of interpretation. Then, the minute they try to interrupt that confusion with one direct question, the focus can shift to the other person's discomfort. Now the conversation is about pressure, about intensity, about timing, about feeling cornered. about needing space. And if you are anxious, you can lose yourself here because you start apologizing for the disruption while still drowning in the thing that disrupted you. That is why the question matters so much. Why is their discomfort so structurally protected while your confusion gets normalized? A healthy bond does not require one person to metabolize all the ambiguity so the other person can stay comfortable. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask is, why do I feel safer suffering quietly than speaking clearly? That question is devastating because the answer usually tells you something important about the structure. In a healthy structure, silence is not safer than honesty. Honesty may feel vulnerable, but it does not feel like self-endangerment. In an unhealthy structure, suffering quietly starts to feel like the more secure option. Not better, safer. That matters, because once your nervous system starts preferring silent pain over direct communication, it is telling you something about the relational environment you are in. It is telling you that expression feels costly. It is telling you that your body has learned a pattern. It is telling you that truth has consequences here that feel bigger than they should. And once that happens, your anxiety is no longer just attached to whether they care. It is attached to whether your needs are allowed to exist without destabilizing the bond. Another question they wish they could ask without punishment is, are you actually unable to give more? Or are you benefiting from not having to define this? This is hard because it forces the structure into view. Some people really are limited. Some people really are confused. Some people really are emotionally underdeveloped. But some people are also quietly benefiting from ambiguity. They get access without accountability, warmth without structure, loyalty without definition, intimacy without clear responsibility. If you have anxious attachment, you may resist this thought because it feels harsh, and because your empathy often wants to explain their behavior in the softest possible way. But structure is not asking you to become cynical. Structure is asking you to notice who benefits from the current setup. If you are the one doing the waiting, interpreting, calming, excusing, softening, shrinking, and holding back your real questions, then you also need to ask who the ambiguity is working for. That is not bitterness. That is clarity. Another painful question anxious people wish they could ask is, why does every real conversation have to happen in the emotional shadow of possible loss? This is one of the cruelest parts of anxious attachment. You are not just trying to talk. You are talking under threat. Threat of distance, threat of coldness, threat of delay. Threat that their energy will change and leave you with more pain than before. So even if the words coming out of your mouth are calm, your body knows the stakes are high. This is why anxious people can sound tentative, overly careful, strangely soft, apologetic, or indirect, even when they are trying to ask something completely reasonable. Their nervous system is already bracing for punishment. And punishment does not have to mean yelling or insult. In these structures, punishment often looks like withdrawal, flattening, deactivation, delay, vagueness, or making you feel like you brought too much reality into a bond that only survives when reality stays half hidden. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask is, why does closeness feel welcome until I respond to it honestly? This is one of the clearest structure versus story moments. The story says they were warm, they were open, they felt it, they were sincere. The structure says, the minute you treat that sincerity like something real, the whole emotional temperature changes. That tells you something load-bearing. It tells you the bond may tolerate closeness better than it tolerates consequence. It may tolerate emotion better than it tolerates definition. It may tolerate the moment better than it tolerates what the moment means in real life. And if you do not name that, you can spend months blaming yourself for reacting to something that really was there. That is the trap. Anxious people are often not inventing the closeness. They are reacting to real moments inside structures that do not know how to carry the meaning of those moments. Another thing they wish they could ask without punishment is, do you want me? Or do you want the version of me that asks for almost nothing? This question hurts because anxious attachment often gets shaped around conditional acceptability. You feel most wanted when you are easy, flexible, understanding, patient, low pressure, self-contained, endlessly interpreting, endlessly compassionate. But what happens when you become real? What happens when you need clarity? What happens when your confusion starts asking for language? What happens when your nervous system stops being willing to survive on implication? If the answer is distance, discomfort, or subtle punishment, then the structure is telling you something. Maybe you are wanted only in the form that least interrupts their comfort. And that is not the same as being loved safely. Another question they wish they could ask is, why does it feel like I have to choose between honesty and connection? That is the deepest structure question of all. Because no one can stay emotionally healthy for long inside a bond where honesty and connection keep getting framed as opposites. At first, anxious people try to manage it. They tell themselves to be more secure, more patient, less reactive, more trusting, more self-contained. Some of that can be good. But there is a point where self-regulation stops being maturity and starts becoming self-erasure. That point usually arrives when your own nervous system is begging for language, and your response is still, no, not yet, don't say it, wait, soften, maybe later. Maybe after a good moment. Maybe after they seem warmer. Maybe after they are less stressed. Maybe after one more sign. Maybe after this weekend. Maybe after they come back softer. That is not peace. That is postponement built on fear. The story says if you ask well enough, softly enough, carefully enough, maybe you can avoid punishment. The structure says, why is punishment even on the table for a normal relational question? That is the pivot. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask is, why am I the only one who seems structurally changed by what happens between us? This matters because the anxious person often carries the residue. Their body holds the pause after the mixed signal, the drop after the soft moment, the ache after the silence, the confusion after the return. They change their behavior. They lose sleep. They monitor tone. They strategize timing. They study patterns. Meanwhile, the other person may resume as if nothing happened, or move in and out with less visible cost. That asymmetry can make the anxious person feel dramatic. But often, they are not being dramatic. They are being impacted. If you wish you could ask, why do I seem to absorb more of the emotional consequence than you do? That is not weakness. That is your system noticing a real structural imbalance. Another thing they wish they could ask is, what would happen if I stopped protecting you from the emotional impact of your own pattern? This question is powerful because it shows how much management anxious people do behind the scenes. They minimize what hurt. They downplay what they know. They cushion their questions. They over-explain their tone. They take too much responsibility for the delivery so the content might be more bearable. They clean up the entire emotional room before asking one direct thing. And even then, sometimes they still get punishment. That is why structure matters more than story. The story will keep tempting you to believe that one more softer conversation will finally work. The structure asks a colder question. Why are you having to overmanage truth just to make it speakable here? Another question they wish they could ask without punishment is, if the bond is real, why does reality keep destabilizing it? This is the simplest version, because that is what hurts. The bond can feel real. The chemistry can feel real. The care can feel real. The tenderness can feel real. But if every attempt to bring that reality into structure creates less steadiness instead of more, then the emotional reality and the relational structure are not aligned. That is what makes anxious attachment so painful. The body feels the bond and keeps hoping the structure will eventually catch up. But if it does not, you end up living in emotional realism and structural denial at the same time. One more thing. A lot of anxious people wish they could ask, am I actually asking too much? Or have I just been trained to experience normal needs as dangerous here? That question can change everything. Because once a bond has normalized self-silencing, your own needs start sounding louder to you than they really are. You feel dramatic for wanting clarity, demanding for wanting follow-through, high maintenance for wanting consistency, too intense for wanting your reality acknowledged. But what if your needs are not too much? What if the structure has just made them feel expensive? That is what anxious people need to keep returning to. Not only what they feel, but what the bond is training them to believe about what they feel. Another thing they wish they could ask is, why do I leave conversations with you less clear than when I entered them? This matters because, in a secure structure, even hard conversations usually create more reality, not less. You may not get everything you want, but you leave knowing more. In unstable structures, you can leave conversations more confused than when you started. The words may sound soft, thoughtful, even emotionally intelligent, but the outcome is fog. You do not know where you stand more clearly. You just know the moment got emotionally managed. That is an important difference. Because anxious people often get soothed by tone while the structure stays unresolved. They hear kindness and think movement happened, but movement is not always clarity. Another thing they wish they could ask without punishment is, why does your comfort seem to depend on my uncertainty? This is another structure question that hurts because it points at the hidden stability of the dynamic. Sometimes, the other person stays comfortable precisely because nothing is fully defined. They can keep the connection, keep the access, keep the emotional atmosphere, and still keep escape routes open. Your uncertainty is not just collateral damage. It is sometimes part of the arrangement that keeps the bond possible for them. If you have anxious attachment, that truth can be devastating because it means the thing hurting you may also be the thing making the bond workable for the other person. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask is, why do I keep needing to prove that my question is reasonable before I am allowed to ask it? Notice how much labor lives in that. They do not just ask. They prepare. They justify. They soften. They explain. They reassure the other person first. They try to prove they are not attacking, not accusing, not overreacting, not being dramatic. They build a whole emotional runway just to ask one normal thing. That is not always just anxiety. Sometimes it is adaptation to a structure where their directness has not been safe. And once you see that, the goal is not only to become braver, it is to tell the truth about what you have been adapting to. Another thing they wish they could ask without punishment is, if you need so much freedom from my reaction, why do you keep doing things that create a reaction? This is one of the most honest questions anxious people rarely say out loud. Because on some level, they understand that they are reacting to something real. They are reacting to inconsistency, implied closeness, emotional reversals, disappearing, vague language, soft returns, disappearing again. Their system is not just inventing activation from thin air, it is responding to a pattern. So the question becomes, why is their reaction treated like the main problem, while the behavior that keeps generating the reaction stays less accountable? That is not a small question. That is a structural question. Another thing anxious people wish they could ask without punishment is, why does it feel like I am only allowed to ask for clarity after I have already detached enough not to need it? This is another cruel piece of the pattern. The bond often seems to tolerate questions only once the emotional stakes are low enough that the answer matters less. When you are most activated, most confused, most in need of reality, that is exactly when asking can feel most dangerous. Then, later, when you are more tired, more numb, or already halfway out, clarity suddenly becomes easier to discuss. But by then, it often lands differently. That is why anxious people can feel chronically starved. The structure does not meet them where they are most vulnerable. It asks them to become less affected before they are allowed to be direct. Another thing they wish they could ask is, why do I keep calling this patience when my body experiences it as fear? This matters because anxious people often use beautiful words for painful adaptations. Patience, understanding, grace, trust, timing, space. Sometimes those words are true, but sometimes they are disguises. Sometimes patience is fear of consequence. Sometimes understanding is self-abandonment with good vocabulary. Sometimes trust is what you call it when you are trying not to trigger the punishment you already expect. This is why structure matters more than the story you tell yourself about your behavior. Your body usually knows the difference. Your body knows whether you are choosing calm or suppressing truth to survive the bond. Another thing they wish they could ask without punishment is, why do I need so much courage just to bring up something your pattern created? That is the heart of it. The anxious person is often not inventing random problems. They are responding to instability, vagueness, contradiction, and relational whiplash. Yet somehow, they are the one who needs courage, timing, tact, softness, emotional precision, and careful delivery, just to name what is happening. That is a clue. Because in a secure structure, reality is not this expensive to speak. So, what does the structure say in a dynamic where you wish you could ask normal questions without punishment? It says, honesty is not safe here in the way it should be. It says, your nervous system has learned to associate truth with destabilization. It says, the story may be warm, hopeful, emotional, even beautiful at times, but the structure is teaching fear. It says, your body does not trust that reality can enter the room without consequence. And once you see that, the goal is no longer to find the perfect wording for your question. The goal becomes seeing what it means that the question feels so dangerous in the first place. Because in a bond that can actually hold you, your honesty may be vulnerable, but it will not feel like a threat to your right to exist there. And if it does, that is not just your anxiety speaking. That is structure. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.